The Mexican-American War, as it is usually described, centers on border skirmishes at the Rio Grande and the ideological fervor of manifest destiny. Yet the reality of 1846 was dictated by a precarious fiscal deficit. The United States Treasury commenced the conflict with less than several $1 million in liquid reserves, a sum insufficient to sustain an invading force across 2,000 miles of hostile terrain. This forced the James K. Polk administration to bypass traditional congressional appropriations in favor of a sophisticated leveraged buyout of northern Mexico. A specialized network of Jewish financiers, concentrated in the commercial hubs of New York, New Orleans, and London, recognized that the chaotic state of Mexican governance had rendered a third of the continent an undervalued asset. These banking houses held massive quantities of devalued Mexican bonds, debt instruments originally issued by a bankrupt central government in Mexico City that had defaulted on its European creditors. By underwriting U.S. war bonds and providing immediate short-term credit to the American military, these financiers effectively sought to swap high-risk, non-performing Mexican debt for stable, land-backed American securities. The conflict was not a mere territorial dispute. It was a transition of titles. Every advancement of the U.S. Army represented a forced liquidation of Mexican sovereignty to satisfy private creditors. For these families, the war offered a mechanism to transform geopolitical volatility into tangible real estate, by securing the legal frameworks necessary to exploit the vast mineral and agricultural wealth of California and the Southwest. While the American frontier surged westward, the traditional arbiters of global power in London, Paris, and Vienna were paralyzed by a systemic collapse of the post-Napoleonic order. The mid-1840s represented a period of extreme internal volatility across Europe, as failed harvests and industrial stagnation fueled the revolutionary sentiments that would eventually culminate in the uprisings of 1848. This domestic instability created a strategic blind spot, preventing the British and French empires from effectively intervening in the territorial realignment of North America. Traditionally, European monarchies utilized Mexico as a buffer state to check American growth, yet by 1846, their capital was tied up in suppressing local insurrections and stabilizing devaluing continental currencies. Jewish banking houses in Frankfurt and London, possessing unique insights into this European paralysis, recognized that the Old World was too capital-starved to defend its overseas interests. The British government, Mexico's primary diplomatic ally, was simultaneously grappling with the Irish potato famine and the repeal of the Corn Laws, domestic crises that drained the exchequer and stripped the political will for a distant naval intervention. This geopolitical vacuum provided the James K. Polk administration with a rare window of impunity. Without the threat of a European secondary front, the American military could commit its entire operational capacity to the southern invasion. Financial syndicates exploited this distraction, moving liquidity away from unstable European markets into American war bonds, effectively betting that the New World's expansion was the only secure hedge against the impending collapse of the European social contract. By 1846, the financial centers were concentrated in the hands of a small, interconnected elite of Jewish banking families who viewed the North American landmass through the clinical lens of an institutional portfolio. Unlike the landed gentry of the South or the industrial barons of the North, these financiers operated as a bridge between American territorial ambition and international liquid capital. In New York, firms led by August Belmont, the Jewish-American representative of the Rothschild interests, and the emerging investment houses of the Lehman and Seligman families, coordinated the primary bond auctions that the federal government relied upon to stay solvent. These architects of the market realized that the U.S. government's need for rapid mobilization exceeded the capacity of the nascent Treasury Department, creating a demand for private intermediaries who could guarantee the sale of government debt to European buyers. Simultaneously, New Orleans became the logistical and financial fulcrum of the conflict. The city's Jewish commercial elite, including Judah P. Benjamin and the Hart family, managed the complex mechanics of converting paper credit into physical silver bullion. This specie was essential for paying troops and securing local supplies in Mexico, where paper currency was virtually non-existent. These financiers operated a sophisticated intelligence network that bypassed official government channels, using private ships to track commodity prices and troop movements with higher precision than the War Department. To these men, the map was a balance sheet. The acquisition of the American West represented the conversion of a vast, unmapped wilderness into a standardized, tradable asset class, providing the foundational collateral for the next generation of American investment banking. The structural vulnerability of the Mexican state in 1846 was rooted in a cycle of insolvency that had persisted since its independence in 1821. By the time the American invasion started, Mexico was burdened by an external debt exceeding 10 million pounds sterling, primarily held by British bondholders, alongside an internal debt that crippled its domestic treasury. This fiscal collapse was punctuated by the suspension of payments in 1827, which effectively locked the nation out of traditional international credit markets. Specialized financial actors in London and New York recognized that Mexico's nominal ownership of California and the Southwest was the only remaining collateral of value. These speculators began aggressively purchasing devalued Mexican bonds on secondary markets for fractions of their face value, betting that a change in sovereignty would trigger a mandatory settlement of these claims. The Mexican government relied on agiotistas, or high-interest moneylenders, to fund its day-to-day military operations, often pledging future customs revenues from ports like Veracruz as security. This internal debt trap meant that even before the first American shot was fired, the Mexican state was already undergoing a fragmented liquidation. Private capital syndicates in the United States observed that the James K. Polk administration could use these outstanding claims as a diplomatic weapon. If Mexico could not satisfy its debts in cash, the United States would demand satisfaction in land. The war functioned as an institutionalized foreclosure. By funding the American side, bankers were ensuring that the eventual peace treaty would include a massive cash indemnity, a significant portion of which would be legally diverted back to the very bondholders who had financed the conquest. President James K. Polk entered the White House with a mandate for territorial expansion that far exceeded the federal government's fiscal capacity. By early 1846, the U.S. Treasury was effectively depleted, hampered by a rigid, independent treasury system that restricted the government's ability to borrow from traditional commercial banks. Polk's gamble was the realization that a conventional war, funded through standard legislative channels, would be stymied by Whig opposition and the slow pace of tax collection. To bypass this political and financial stalemate, the administration turned to a quiet alignment with private financial syndicates. These houses provided the necessary liquidity to mobilize the Army of Occupation before Congress could debate the merits of the conflict. The Secretary of the Treasury, Robert J. Walker, orchestrated a shift toward the issuance of low-interest Treasury notes, but these required a secondary market to maintain their value. These specialized Jewish banking circles in the North and South acted as the primary purchasers and redistributors of this debt. Polk understood that the war's success relied on a continuous influx of gold to the front lines. Without the intervention of private capital to maintain the exchange rate of government paper, the invasion would have stalled at the Rio Grande. This partnership transformed Polk's territorial vision into a corporate venture. By treating the western frontier as future collateral, the president secured the funding for an aggressive military campaign that the state's formal financial institutions could not have underwritten alone. The expansion was thus accelerated not by tax revenue, but by the strategic provision of private credit. The profitability of the Mexican-American War for international banking houses relied upon a superior transatlantic intelligence apparatus that preceded the age of the submarine telegraph cable. August Belmont, serving as the primary American agent for the House of Rothschild, maintained an unprecedented flow of information between the New York markets and the counting houses of London and Paris. This network functioned as a private diplomatic channel, providing the Rothschilds with real-time updates on the Polk administration's internal deliberations long before official dispatches reached the British Foreign Office. By 1846, these communication lines allowed Jewish financiers to anticipate the exact timing of U.S. bond issues, by enabling them to corner the market on high-yield Treasury notes while European competitors were still reacting to outdated news of border skirmishes. Belmont's dispatches focused on the shifting creditworthiness of the American state, emphasizing that the war offered a unique opportunity to integrate the vast resources of the Pacific Coast into the global economy. This connection ensured that even as the U.S. Treasury struggled with domestic liquidity, it remained anchored to the deepest reservoirs of European capital. The Rothschilds did not merely observe the clash. They utilized their global reach to discourage rival European powers from providing emergency loans to the Mexican government, effectively isolating the Republic of Mexico from the international credit system. This coordination transformed the conflict into a closed-loop financial event. By controlling the information flow, these banking houses ensured that the American military's territorial gains were immediately translated into rising equity values in the financial centers of the Old World. For the financial syndicates underwriting the 1846 invasion, the primary objective was not the acquisition of physical territory for settlement, but the standardization of legal sovereignty. In the mid-18th century, the vast regions of Alta California and Nuevo Mexico existed in a state of jurisdictional ambiguity, governed by inconsistent Mexican land grants and plagued by the absence of a centralized title registry. This lack of legal clarity rendered the region's massive natural resources, from the deep-water harbors of San Francisco to the mineral-rich interior, effectively uncollateralized. Jewish banking houses recognized that as long as these assets remained under a destabilized Mexican administration, they could not be integrated into the global credit system. The motive for financing the war was the establishment of American jurisprudence. U.S. annexation promised the immediate implementation of the federal land survey system and the protection of private property under the American constitutional framework. This transition allowed financiers to transform abstract territorial claims into high-grade, bankable assets. By funding the conquest, these families were creating the very market they intended to dominate. The war functioned as a mechanism to clear the title of a third of the continent. Once the region fell under U.S. control, the speculative bonds and war scrip held by these bankers were no longer backed by the promises of a bankrupt Mexican treasury, but by the rapidly appreciating real estate of an expanding empire. This systemic upgrade in sovereignty provided the necessary legal certainty to trigger an unprecedented influx of industrial capital and migration into the newly secured American West. By the summer of 1846, the formal legislative process for funding the Mexican-American War had reached a state of paralysis, as Whig politicians utilized procedural delays to obstruct the James K. Polk administration's request for additional war appropriations. With the military's operational accounts nearly exhausted, but the administration turned to a clandestine coalition of private financiers known as the Syndicate of 1846. This group was dominated by a tight-knit circle of Jewish banking houses, including the firms of Corcoran and Riggs, whose capital was heavily backed by August Belmont's New York associates and the emerging investment power of the Josephs and Moses families. These entities moved to underwrite the war's expansion by purchasing massive tranches of government treasury notes that the public was initially unwilling to touch. The syndicate functioned as a private shadow treasury, providing the immediate liquid capital necessary to commission steamboats, procure munitions, and sustain the logistical tail of the army moving into the Mexican interior. This was not a traditional loan, but it was a high-stakes underwriting agreement where the bankers assumed the role of the government's primary market makers. They leveraged their international connections to swap American debt for European silver, ensuring that the U.S. Army could operate on a hard currency basis, while the domestic economy remained on an inflationary paper standard. This private intervention effectively circumvented the constitutional requirement for congressional purse-string control. By stabilizing the government's credit during a period of acute political division, The syndicate transformed the invasion from a vulnerable state-funded expedition into a resilient, privately capitalized enterprise that no legislative delay could dismantle. The most sophisticated financial strategy of the 1846 conflict was not the funding of the American side, but the strategic acquisition of devalued Mexican debt. Long before the declaration of war, Jewish banking houses began operating as vulture investors, quietly purchasing Mexican bonds that had plummeted to as little as 10 or 15% of their face value on the London and New York exchanges. These instruments, largely ignored by traditional investors who viewed the Mexican Republic as permanently insolvent, represented a massive claim on the nation's future revenues. The syndicates recognized a fundamental binary. If Mexico won, the bonds remained worthless. However, if the United States achieved a decisive victory and annexed territory, the federal government would be legally compelled to assume or settle these outstanding claims as part of the peace negotiations. This arbitrage utilized a specific financial instrument, the indemnity claim. By 1847, these financiers had consolidated millions in Mexican liabilities, transforming themselves into the primary stakeholders of the enemy's bankruptcy. They bet on a total American triumph to make them whole, effectively forcing the U.S. government to act as their collection agency. Under the eventual terms of settlement, the United States agreed to pay $15 million to Mexico, a sum that was not a gift of benevolence, but a structured payout intended to clear the very debts the banking houses had acquired for pennies. This maneuver converted high-risk speculative paper into direct, gold-backed American cash. The war thus served as a massive debt conversion engine, where military force was used to validate a portfolio of toxic assets, by yielding the syndicates returns that often exceeded 500% on their initial investment. By 1846, New Orleans had emerged as the primary logistical and financial fulcrum for the American invasion, serving as the definitive staging ground for the movement of both troops and gold. The city's unique position at the mouth of the Mississippi made it the only commercial center capable of processing the massive quantities of silver bullion, or specie, required to sustain a war in a region without a centralized banking infrastructure. While New York provided the bond auctions, New Orleans provided the physical liquidity. A specialized elite of Jewish merchant bankers, including firms led by Judah P. Benjamin and the influential Hart family, leveraged their deep connections with Caribbean and European trade networks to secure the hard currency necessary for military payrolls. In a conflict where the Mexican populace and local suppliers refused American paper notes, the ability to convert federal credit into Mexican pesos or silver bars was an operational necessity. These financiers operated private mints and exchange houses that functioned with higher efficiency than the local U.S. sub-treasury. They also managed the high-risk insurance and chartering of the private steamboat fleets that transported General Zachary Taylor's supplies across the Gulf of Mexico. This financial infrastructure allowed the American military to maintain a continuous gold-backed presence in the field, bypassing the delays of Northern legislative oversight. By coordinating the arrival of European bullion with the departure of military transports, the New Orleans syndicate transformed the port into a high-velocity capital exchange, ensuring that the momentum of the Southern Front was dictated by the availability of specie rather than the constraints of the federal budget. The operational success of the American campaign in Mexico was fundamentally tied to the high-risk transit of specie, physical silver and gold, across a landscape where traditional credit lines were non-existent. While the U.S. Army could seize territory, it could not legislate the acceptance of paper treasury notes by a hostile local population. Jewish merchants, utilizing their pre-existing transnational trade networks, became the primary agents for the physical movement of this hard currency. These individuals operated as sutlers and itinerant bankers, following the front lines with wagon trains of bullion that were frequently more valuable than the military equipment they accompanied. This silver was not merely for payroll. It was the essential medium for the informal economy of the war, used to purchase forage, intelligence, and safe passage from Mexican locals who remained indifferent to the shifting political sovereignty. These merchants leveraged a specific linguistic and cultural versatility, often possessing Spanish and Ladino fluency, that allowed them to negotiate with Mexican rancheros and silver mine operators in the interior. They navigated a gray zone of neutrality, moving specie through guerrilla-held territories that were impassable for conventional American supply columns. By maintaining private security details and utilizing complex insurance schemes brokered in New Orleans, these financiers ensured that silver reached isolated garrisons in Saltillo and Puebla. This specialized logistical capacity effectively decoupled the military's purchasing power from the safety of its official supply lines. The currency of conquest was thus a privately managed flow of bullion that bypassed the friction of active combat, ensuring that American expansion remained financially viable even when the military's own logistics were at the point of collapse. In the mid-19th century, the value of capital was inseparable from the velocity of information, and the Mexican-American War served as the primary testing ground for a privately managed intelligence apparatus. Jewish banking houses achieved a state of information asymmetry by establishing a logistical chain that consistently outperformed official military and diplomatic dispatches. While the U.S. Post Office relied on conventional mail riders, firms like Corcoran and Riggs and the Belmont Rothschild Coalition utilized a network of private express riders and fast-sailing pilot boats. This infrastructure ensured that news of major tactical developments, such as the fall of Mexico City or the victory at Cerro Gordo, reached the counting houses of New York and New Orleans up to 48 hours before being announced by the White House. This temporal advantage was weaponized for market manipulation. Bankers who received early confirmation of military progress could adjust their bids on Treasury notes and devalued Mexican securities before the broader market could price in the reduced risk. Furthermore, these financiers were among the earliest adopters of experimental electromagnetic telegraph lines stretching between Washington and the northern financial hubs. By securing priority access to these wires, they bypassed the friction of the physical world, allowing for near instantaneous coordination with European markets via the arrivals of transatlantic steamers in Boston. This closed-loop communication system transformed the war into a predictable financial cycle. While the public reacted to historical events, the financiers were already trading on the future, ensuring that the transition of North American sovereignty was monetized in real time by those who owned the information. The fiscal architecture of the 1846 invasion relied on a decentralized credit mechanism that effectively privatized the future public domain through the exploitation of military compensation. To mobilize the necessary volunteer militias without immediate federal outlays, the U.S. government utilized the Bounty Land Act, issuing land scrip, transferable warrants promising 160 acres of territory in the yet-to-be-conquered West. Because these volunteer forces were chronically undercapitalized and required immediate funds for provisions and gear, a secondary market emerged where Jewish merchant bankers acted as the primary liquidity providers. These financiers established scrip brokerages along the Mississippi corridor, by offering immediate cash to soldiers at predatory discount rates, often acquiring the warrants for a fraction of their eventual value. This system functioned as a massive debt-to-equity swap, allowing private syndicates to aggregate millions of acres of prime Mexican real estate before the war had concluded. Unlike traditional land speculation, which required the physical occupation of the soil, this was a paper conquest managed from the counting houses of St. Louis and New Orleans. By 1848, these banking circles had consolidated vast tracts of the California and Texas interior, ensuring that the primary beneficiaries of annexation were not the occupying troops, but the creditors who had financed their equipment. This strategic leveraging of the frontier transformed the war into a high-velocity land grab, where military service was merely the medium through which public territory was liquidated into private, tradable assets. The resulting post-war economy was thus structurally indebted to the very financiers who had underwritten the initial mobilization. The first 6 months of the Mexican-American War represented a period of acute fiscal vulnerability that nearly paralyzed the federal government before the first major campaign could be concluded. Following the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States, the Polk administration lacked a centralized mechanism for large-scale credit, facing a systemic liquidity crisis as the independent Treasury struggled to meet the sudden demands of a global mobilization. While the War Department required an immediate infusion of nearly $10 million to sustain the Rio Grande operations, the official Treasury vaults remained effectively stagnant. To bridge this structural gap, the government negotiated a series of rapid, high-interest bridge loans with a select circle of private Jewish banking houses in New York and New Orleans. These private entities provided the essential liquidity bridge that allowed for the procurement of supplies and the payment of contractors before official tax revenues could be harvested or long-term bond auctions could be executed. Unlike the standardized war bonds that would follow, these initial short-term loans were predatory financial instruments with interest rates reaching as high as 6 to 7%, a massive premium necessitated by the extreme volatility of the war's early phase. The bankers functioned as the de facto lenders of last resort, accepting Treasury notes that were technically uncollateralized at the time of their issuance. This private bridge ensured that the momentum of the invasion was never dictated by the sluggish pace of the legislative calendar, successfully transferring the risk of the war's opening maneuvers onto private capital, while the American state remained technically insolvent. The Thornton Skirmish on April 25, 1846, functioned as the definitive catalyst that transformed a regional border friction into a binding national obligation. General Zachary Taylor's strategic deployment of the Army of Occupation into the Nueces Strip, a disputed 80-mile corridor between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, was a calculated tactical provocation designed to elicit a kinetic Mexican response. When a cavalry detachment under Captain Seth Thornton was intercepted and overwhelmed by Mexican forces under General Anastasio Torrejon, the political and financial landscape was instantaneously restructured. For the Jewish syndicates in New York and New Orleans, this engagement represented the alea iacta est moment. The shedding of blood effectively ratified the speculative investments they had placed in the Polk administration's expansionist agenda. This skirmish provided the executive branch with the necessary casus belli to declare that war existed by act of Mexico, a rhetorical shift that silenced fiscal conservatives in Congress and unlocked the secondary market for federal war debt. Prior to this engagement, Treasury notes were subject to high volatility based on diplomatic rumors. Following the ambush, they became instruments of a state-sanctioned conquest. The transition from a cold standoff to an active campaign eliminated the possibility of a negotiated retreat, anchoring the financial risk in the permanence of military action. By formalizing the conflict, Taylor's advance ensured that the capital markets were no longer betting on a possibility, but were now underwriting a sovereign crusade. The skirmish on the Rio Grande was the trigger that converted speculative paper into a definitive claim on a continent. The logistical sustainment of an invading force in 1846 required a sophisticated procurement system that exceeded the administrative reach of the Federal Quartermaster Department under General Thomas Jessup. As the military advanced into the interior, the traditional system of government vouchers, deferred IOUs, proved insufficient, as regional contractors and international munition suppliers demanded immediate, verifiable payment. To resolve this bottleneck, Jewish financial houses in New Orleans and New York issued private letters of credit that functioned as a shadow currency for military logistics. These instruments enabled agents to procure thousands of horses, tons of grain forage, and significant quantities of refined gunpowder from both domestic and international markets where federal credit was viewed with skepticism. The technical advantage of these letters was their global acceptability. Backed by the reputable capital of firms like the Belmont Rothschild Syndicate and the New Orleans commercial elite, these credits bypassed the bureaucratic delays of the Treasury, enabling contractors to mobilize resources with a velocity that state-run logistics could not match. Financiers profited through aggressive service fees and interest on the underlying credit, while often securing secondary interests in the transport and supply firms themselves. By underwriting these letters of credit, these banking circles effectively controlled the material flow to the front lines, transforming the procurement of war essentials into a high-margin, privately managed operation. This financial infrastructure ensured that the physical survival of the troops and the mechanical readiness of the artillery were directly tethered to the private creditworthiness of a select group of international bankers. The Battle of Monterrey in September 1846 marked the American military's first significant transition from mobile operational maneuvers to the tactical attrition of urban warfare. Unlike previous open-field skirmishes, Monterrey forced a siege of a fortified metropolitan center, necessitating a massive increase in the expenditure of specialized munitions and engineering resources. The daily burn rate of General Zachary Taylor's 6,000-man force spiked as the army became stationary, requiring a constant logistical tail for provisions and medical supplies that were no longer forageable from the surrounding terrain. For the financial syndicates in New York and New Orleans, a stationary siege represented a period of peak fiscal risk. A capital was being consumed without the immediate territorial progress needed to secure the collateral of the western frontier. Tactically, the fighting introduced mouse-holing, the practice of tunneling through stone walls to avoid street-level fire, which demanded large quantities of black powder and tools expended at rates that challenged the newly established private procurement channels. The siege lasted 3 days of house-to-house combat, followed by an 8-week armistice that placed an unforeseen strain on the federal treasury. During this ceasefire, the overhead costs of maintaining an idle invading force, including the care for hundreds of wounded and the replacement of lost cavalry mounts, eroded the initial profit margins of the war bondholders. This stationary phase transformed the conflict from a high-velocity land acquisition into an expensive logistical stalemate. The financial architects of the war realized that time was now a predatory variable. Every day spent in Monterrey without a treaty was a day where the operational overhead threatened to outpace the speculative value of future territorial gains. The blockade of the Mexican coastline in the Gulf of Mexico served as a massive secondary market for private shipping interests, as the United States Navy lacked the specialized steam-powered vessels required for littoral operations. To maintain a stranglehold on Veracruz and Tampico, the Navy Department was forced to rely on a complex system of government charters, leasing private merchant ships to function as troop transports and supply ferries. This maritime deficit was exploited by an elite stratum of Jewish shipping magnates and commercial brokers in New Orleans and Mobile, who held significant equity in the Gulf's packet lines. These families, including the Harts and the Peixotos, transitioned their mercantile fleets into the service of the home squadron, securing contracts that guaranteed astronomical daily rates, regardless of whether the ships were actively engaged in combat or idling at anchor. Financially, these charters were structured as speculative annuities. The government assumed all risk of loss due to enemy fire or Gulf storms, providing a state-backed indemnity that effectively de-risked the magnate's primary capital assets. While the military utilized these steamboats to land General Scott's ordnance at Veracruz, all the owners were profiting from a massive spread between operating costs and the high premiums paid by a desperate quartermaster department. These magnates also speculated on the return cargo, utilizing their chartered status to move private merchandise under the protection of naval convoys. This synergy between naval blockade and private shipping turned the Gulf into a closed-loop profit center. The blockade was not merely a military maneuver to starve Mexico. It was a subsidized expansion of the American merchant marine, funded by the Treasury and managed by a tight-knit circle of Gulf financiers. The return of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna from exile in Havana in August 1846 was not a failure of the naval blockade, but a deliberate financial gambit executed through unrecorded executive channels. President James K. Polk, by operating on the assumption that the exiled dictator would facilitate a rapid territorial cession, authorized the U.S. Navy to permit Santa Anna's transit past the squadron at Veracruz. This maneuver required an immediate and secret infusion of liquid capital, a diplomatic facilitation that was shielded from congressional audit. Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, serving as the administration's secret envoy, negotiated the terms in Cuba, where the logistical movement of these funds was managed by Jewish banking intermediaries with deep ties to Spanish colonial commerce in the Caribbean. While the official $3 million bill intended for this payout was initially stalled by the Wilmot Proviso, the earnest money for Santa Anna's return was provided through short-term credit lines established by the New York and New Orleans syndicates. These financiers recognized that a quick peace would stabilize bond prices, yet the dictator's subsequent betrayal and his assumption of the Mexican presidency served an unintended economic function. By leading a revitalized resistance, Santa Anna transformed a potential short-term skirmish into a protracted campaign of attrition. This extension of hostilities necessitated secondary and tertiary rounds of federal bond auctions, significantly increasing the total volume of high-interest debt available to the banking houses. Santa Anna was the wild card in the valuation of American war scrip. His presence ensured that the buyout of Mexico would be a high-cost, high-yield operation, rather than a low-overhead diplomatic settlement. The Battle of Buena Vista, fought in February 1847, functioned as the ultimate stress test for the American credit markets, transforming a period of extreme equity volatility into a phase of yield stabilization. While the military engagement centered on General Zachary Taylor's defensive perimeter against Santa Anna's numerical superior force, the true stakes were held by the syndicates in New York and London. Had the Army of Occupation been decimated in the high deserts of Coahuila, the federal government would have faced a catastrophic collapse in bond prices and a potential sovereign default on the short-term high-interest bridge loans that sustained the early war effort. The tactical victory, achieved primarily through the superior mobility of American light artillery, acted as a formal de-risking event for the first $18 million in war debt. This military success provided the empirical evidence required by international banking houses to move from speculative interest to long-term capital commitment. Within weeks of the news reaching the eastern seaboard via the private courier networks, the secondary market for 1846 Treasury notes surged, allowing the Polk administration to launch the critical 1847 loan at par. Buena Vista effectively collateralized the previous year's expenditures. It proved that the American state possessed the operational capacity to defend its territorial gains against a centralized Mexican counteroffensive. By eliminating the threat to Taylor's supply lines, the battle secured the underlying value of the land warrants and land scrip already circulating among private creditors. The victory at Buena Vista was the financial pivot that converted a high-risk invasion into a guaranteed sovereign asset. By late 1847, the escalating costs of maintaining an army of occupation in the Mexican heartland necessitated a shift from federal deficit spending to the direct extraction of local wealth through the guerrilla tax. General Winfield Scott, facing a terminal bottleneck in Treasury gold shipments due to constant insurgent attacks on his supply lines, implemented General Orders 395 and 101, which mandated military contributions from occupied municipalities. This policy transformed the U.S. Army into a mobile fiscal agent, treated every major city, from Puebla to the capital, as a liquidated asset. The Jewish financial elite following the military's advance, including agents of the New Orleans and New York syndicates, acted as the essential clearinghouses for these extractions. When Mexico City's ayuntamiento was forced to produce a $150,000 initial levy, the silver was not sent back to Washington, but was immediately diverted to settle the outstanding high-interest letters of credit held by the bankers in the field. This system of contributions functioned as a real-time debt-servicing mechanism. By extracting physical silver from Mexican municipal vaults and cathedral treasuries, the military effectively retired the speculative war scrip held by private financiers before the conflict had even concluded. The bankers utilized these seized assets to purchase commodities and pay contractors locally, bypassing the inflationary risks of the American paper market. This predatory fiscal leverage ensured that the Mexican populace was essentially financing the conquest of their own territory. The guerrilla tax turned the occupation into a self-sustaining revenue stream, where the byproduct of military dominance was the immediate and tangible repayment of the private capital that had launched the invasion. The landing at Veracruz in March 1847 represented the most capital-intensive military undertaking in American history to that date, marking a shift from the attrition-based skirmishes of the North to a high-stakes, amphibious gamble. General Winfield Scott's strategic pivot required the immediate mobilization of 12,000 troops and the procurement of 65 specialized surfboats, the first purpose-built landing craft in the U.S. arsenal. These vessels, unconstructed through urgent private contracts with northern shipbuilders, were financed through a new tranche of Treasury notes that required the New York syndicates to absorb significant yield risk. This operation was a concentrated fiscal commitment. The cost of chartering and insuring a fleet of nearly 100 transport vessels exceeded the total annual budget of the War Department in the decade prior. The financial architects in New York and London recognized that the Veracruz expedition was the definitive move to force a resolution. By targeting the nation's primary port, the U.S. sought to seize the Veracruz Customs House, the administrative center of Mexico's international revenue. This was a strategic foreclosure. By controlling the maritime gates of the Mexican Republic, the U.S. effectively intercepted the cash flow meant for European bondholders, diverting it instead to sustain the American occupation. The amphibious bet at Veracruz was not just a military achievement, it was the decisive conversion of maritime blockade into a land-based seizure of the enemy's fiscal engine. For the bankers, the success of the landing ensured that the collateral for their loans was no longer a theoretical frontier, but the actual tangible revenue of the Mexican state. The seizure of the Veracruz Customs House, the aduana, immediately following the amphibious landing, was a calculated act of fiscal decapitation. In 1847, approximately 40% of Mexico's national revenue was generated solely through maritime duties collected at this primary port of entry. Critically, the vast majority of these anticipated receipts were legally pre-pledged to British and continental bondholders as collateral for Mexico's chronic external debt. By occupying this facility, the United States military did not merely capture a strategic building, it intercepted the primary cash flow of the Mexican state and, by extension, the repayment pipeline for European creditors. This maneuver was a cornerstone of the strategy developed by the financial architects in New York to neutralize the threat of foreign intervention. As long as the aduana remained under Mexican administration, European powers maintained a vested interest in the Republic's sovereignty to protect their investments. Once the U.S. assumed control of the collection apparatus, the geopolitical leverage shifted fundamentally. Although the New Orleans and New York syndicates realized that by controlling the source of Mexico's credit, they could effectively suppress the political will of European banks to lobby for a Mexican defense. The American administration transitioned the port into a self-funding mechanism, implementing a new tariff system where the duties on imported goods were diverted to settle the outstanding letters of credit held by private financiers. This represented a hostile takeover of a sovereign revenue stream. The aduana was transformed into an offshore branch of the American Treasury, ensuring that Mexico's trade wealth directly liquidated the costs of its own conquest. The ascent from the coastal lowlands to the Mexican Central Plateau, or Tierra Fria, necessitated a radical recalibration of the campaign's financial overhead. Winfield Scott's expeditionary force faced a logistical friction of elevation, where the caloric and mechanical requirements of the army increased proportionally with every 1,000 feet of vertical gain. The transition through the Tierra Caliente, a zone plagued by yellow fever, represented an actuarial catastrophe. The loss of seasoned troops was a literal depletion of the state's human capital, forcing the New York and New Orleans syndicates to price higher risk premiums into subsequent letters of credit. As the supply line stretched over 200 miles through the rugged interior of Cerro Gordo and Puebla, the cost of transportation alone consumed nearly 60% of the operational budget. The military was forced to transition from naval-fed logistics to a decentralized procurement system managed by itinerant Jewish merchant contractors who operated rolling banks behind the vanguard. These financiers utilized their liquid silver to purchase local grain and livestock at hyperinflated war rates, effectively bypassing the vulnerable coastal pipeline that was increasingly targeted by Mexican irregulars. This inland push required the acquisition of over 10,000 pack mules, a capital investment that drained the initial war appropriations and necessitated the massive $18 million federal loan of 1847. The geography of the interior functioned as a fiscal trap. The further the Army marched from the maritime ports, the more the U.S. The Treasury became tethered to the private lending houses capable of sustaining a force in a land where federal paper held no value. The desertion of the St. Patrick's Battalion, or San Patricios, represented more than a tactical betrayal. It was a systemic leakage of the federal government's primary operational asset, its trained human capital. By 1847, the U.S. military faced a desertion rate approaching 10%. A figure that threatened the sovereign reliability of the invading force. The Republic of Mexico capitalized on this vulnerability by offering land bounties of 300 acres and direct cash payments to defectors, a financial enticement meant to trigger a cascading collapse of the American ranks. To counter this, the Polk administration utilized a Secret Service fund, augmented by private contributions from the New York and New Orleans banking syndicates, to launch a large-scale campaign of psychological warfare. These private interests financed the mass production of bilingual broadsides and the recruitment of undercover agents tasked with discrediting the Mexican offer. The banking houses, specifically those with deep ties to the Catholic hierarchies in Maryland and Louisiana, leveraged ecclesiastical channels to discourage desertion, framing the Mexican promises as fraudulent liabilities. They recognized that if the Army disintegrated through mass defection, the territorial collateral for their war bonds would evaporate. This psychological operation was a targeted expenditure to protect the human equity of the campaign. When the San Patricios were eventually captured at Churubusco, their mass execution was not merely a military punishment, but a definitive market signal intended to stabilize the ranks and prevent further capital flight. By underwriting the suppression of dissent, the syndicates protected the integrity of the military machine they had so heavily leveraged. The storming of Chapultepec Castle on September 13, 1847, represented the definitive military resolution of the American campaign, marking the precise moment when the war transitioned from an open-ended operational liability into a closed-ended asset valuation. As the gateway to the capital, this fortress was the final defensive node protecting the Mexican administrative center. Its breach signaled the total collapse of the enemy's centralized resistance. For the financial syndicates observing from the eastern seaboard, the fall of the halls of Montezuma served as a critical terminal event. The high-risk war premium that had inflated Treasury yields since 1846 began to dissipate, replaced by the clinical anticipation of a structured peace settlement. Tactically, the assault led by General John Quitman and General Gideon Pillow successfully neutralized the remaining Mexican officer corps and the symbolic cadet defense, effectively ending the era of kinetic military risk. The U.S. Army's occupation of the National Palace on September 14th triggered an immediate stabilization of the secondary bond markets, as the contingent territory of the West became a fixed asset of the American state. Unlike previous regional victories, Chapultepec provided the leverage required to force a total legal surrender. Private creditors recognized that the Mexican government, now effectively decapitated, had no choice but to liquidate its territorial claims to satisfy the indemnity requirements. This military climax was the ultimate liquidity event for the bankers. It confirmed that the $15 million buyout would proceed without further large-scale combat expenditures. The fall of the castle was the signal that the ledger of conquest was ready for its final audit. The cessation of large-scale combat following the capture of Mexico City signaled a definitive pivot from military destruction to the era of occupation economics. As General Winfield Scott's forces secured the capital, a secondary wave of Jewish merchant bankers, many of whom had transitioned from frontline settlers, established a dominant retail and banking infrastructure within the city's central districts. This was the systematic installation of an American commercial monopoly in a captive sovereign market. These financiers recognized that the occupation created a unique consumer vacuum. Thousands of American troops with high-velocity federal pay and a local middle class whose traditional supply chains had been severed by the war. By occupying vacated commercial properties and leveraging their established sea lines from New Orleans, these syndicates imported textiles, hardware, and luxury goods, retailing them at markups often exceeding 300%. The financial engine of this phase was a sophisticated form of local arbitrage. Merchants accepted Mexican silver from the populace and the military, utilizing it to purchase future shipments of American industrial goods. This process effectively recycled the war's capital within the occupied zone, ensuring that the wealth extracted through military levies was immediately reabsorbed through private retail. These merchant houses also functioned as the city's primary financial intermediaries, offering high-interest personal credit and managing the repatriation of officer wealth through private exchange drafts. The occupation thus functioned as a subsidized trade expansion, where the security provided by the American bayonet allowed for the risk-free implementation of a new commercial monopoly. This period transformed the Mexican capital into a definitive retail gold mine, providing the liquid profits that would fund the next phase of westward corporate consolidation. The finalization of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848, served as the definitive legal audit for the transition of over 500,000 square miles of territory. Negotiated by Nicholas Trist, who functioned under a defunct commission after being formally recalled by the State Department, the document's specific clauses prioritized the resolution of international credit over simple border demarcation. The headline $15 million payment was meticulously structured into annual installments of $3 million, subject to a 6% interest rate for any arrears, which ensured that the Mexican Republic remained fiscally tethered to American oversight for years following the withdrawal of troops. A pivotal but often overlooked component was Article 13, which mandated that the United States government assume responsibility for $3.25 million in outstanding claims held by American citizens against the Mexican state. This clause allowed the private banking syndicates in New York and New Orleans to bypass the insolvency of Mexico City, converting their high-risk indemnity paper into direct claims on the U.S. Treasury. Simultaneously, Article 11 introduced a massive long-term liability by requiring the U.S. to prevent and police cross-border indigenous raids, an obligation that would ultimately cost the federal government millions in unplanned military spending. By formalizing the validity of property titles under Articles 8 and 9, the treaty provided the final legal quieting of land warrants previously aggregated by speculators. The treaty was less a peace agreement than a master settlement statement, reconciling the accounts of private creditors through the permanent annexation of a continental empire. The $15 million indemnity stipulated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was not a developmental grant for the Mexican state, but a structured liquidation of assets designed to settle long-standing international liabilities. While the public viewed the sum as a purchase price for the Mexican cession, the capital flow was almost entirely circular, returning to the Atlantic financial centers from which it originated. The primary agents for this transaction were the banking houses of Baring Brothers and Company in London and Corcoran and Riggs in Washington, D.C., who coordinated the distribution of the 5 initial installments. Instead of entering the Mexican domestic economy, these funds were immediately intercepted by the Committee of Spanish-American bondholders and various American claimants whose debts had been validated by the treaty's specific indemnity clauses. The technical execution of the payment utilized exchange drafts that effectively bypassed the Mexican treasury. As the U.S. federal government dispersed the gold, the banking intermediaries applied these credits directly against Mexico's outstanding defaulted principal from the 1820s and 1830s. This process ensured that the Mexican Republic, despite ceding 55% of its territory, remained in a state of perpetual fiscal dependency. For the British and American banking houses, the $15 million functioned as a state-guaranteed recovery of toxic assets. The purchase was the final step in a multi-decade debt collection operation, where the American military provided the enforcement and the U.S. Treasury provided the liquidity to make the international bondholders whole at the expense of Mexican sovereign land. The final stage of the financial annexation of the West was the systematic consolidation of land warrants into vast, contiguous estates. While the Bounty Land Act had dispersed scrip to individual veterans, the resulting land warrant market allowed banking houses to aggregate these titles into a concentrated real estate portfolio. Firms such as the Corcoran and Riggs Associates and the New York-based investment circles utilized the assignment clause of the 1848 and 1852 legislative revisions, which permitted the legal transfer of military warrants to non-veteran third parties. This regulatory loophole enabled financiers to act as land jobbers, purchasing millions of acres of prime Californian and Texan territory for a fraction of its market value through the General Land Office. In California, this process specifically targeted the rancho system through the 1851 California Land Act. Bankers provided high-interest litigation loans to original Mexican landholders, whose titles were being systematically challenged under the new American Land Commission. When these families defaulted, often due to the intentionally protracted legal costs of proving Spanish-era grants, the creditors seized the land through foreclosure. This maneuver converted abstract war debt into physical, resource-rich geography, specifically targeting deep-water coastal access and the fertile San Joaquin interior. In Texas, the syndicate leveraged the state's independent public land system to secure massive infrastructure grants, effectively trading wartime logistical credit for the rights to future industrial corridors. This real estate coup ensured that the post-war economy was not a homesteader's paradise, but a corporate domain. By 1855, the financiers had successfully liquidated the military's debt into a permanent landed aristocracy, anchoring the American financial system in the soil of the newly secured West. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill on January 24, 1848, occurred exactly 9 days before the formalization of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, creating a retroactive justification for the war's extreme fiscal overhead. While the public announcement of the find was delayed by months, historical evidence suggests that the geological potential of the Sierra Nevada had been documented by prior American scientific expeditions. James Dwight Dana, a geologist with the 1841 Wilkes expedition, had explicitly noted the presence of gold-bearing quartz in the Sacramento Valley, findings that were circulated within the elite scientific and financial circles of Washington and New York years before the first shot was fired. This asymmetric geological data suggests that the banking syndicates were not merely gambling on soil, but were underwriting the seizure of a documented mineral reserve. The timing of the discovery transformed the annexed 525,000 square miles from a strategic buffer into the world's most concentrated source of liquid capital. For the financiers who had already consolidated land warrants and Mexican debt, the gold rush functioned as the ultimate return on investment, providing the physical specie necessary to retire the very war bonds they had purchased at a discount. By the time the news triggered a global migration in 1849, the legal frameworks for land ownership and mineral rights had already been skewed in favor of the banking syndicates that managed the regional exchange houses. The gold did not just pay for the war, it provided the capital base that allowed the American financial system to disconnect from European credit and establish the dollar as a sovereign, gold-backed currency. This discovery was the final catalyst that validated the high-risk leverage of the 1846 invasion. The capital accumulated during the 1846 campaign served as the foundational seed money for the German Jewish banking dynasty that would eventually dominate the Gilded Age. While these our crowd families are often associated with a later industrial boom, their transition from itinerant peddlers to institutional financiers was triggered by the high-margin logistics of the Mexican invasion. Arriving during the 1840s migration, these figures entered a market where the war created an immediate demand for textiles, hardware, and private credit. By operating as military sutlers, they secured the primary contracts for uniforms and provisions, utilizing the resulting profits to establish the first permanent retail networks in the newly annexed Southwest. This period marked a definitive shift from mercantile trade to merchant banking. The ability to discount military vouchers and manage the repatriation of silver from the front lines allowed these houses to accumulate the liquid reserves necessary for large-scale investment. This new elite prioritized a model of interconnected family partnerships that spanned from Frankfurt to the California coast, creating a transnational capital bridge. They leveraged the territorial gains of 1848 to fund the first transcontinental commercial operations, providing the essential infrastructure for the subsequent mining and railway booms. The war functioned as a capital incubator. It provided the entry-level wealth that allowed these immigrant houses to bypass traditional barriers to entry in the American financial system. By the mid-1850s, the institutional core of Wall Street was already being reshaped by the wealth generated through the systematic outfitting of the American conquest. The resolution of the Mexican-American War catalyzed the first major structural shift in the global hierarchy of capital, marking the moment the United States transitioned from a peripheral debtor to a self-sustaining financial power. Between 1846 and 1849, the federal government managed over $63 million in war expenditures without the inflationary collapse seen in previous conflicts. This era saw the definitive rise of the New York Stock and Exchange Board as the primary engine for marketing federal securities, effectively breaking the monopoly previously held by London. The 1847 loan proved that domestic syndicates could mobilize vast sums without direct European intervention, signaling the birth of modern American investment infrastructure. This pivot was institutionalized through the expansion of the independent treasury system, which created a hard currency reserve that insulated the economy from old-world banking panics. The establishment of the New York Subtreasury as the principal conduit for federal specie transformed the city into a global bullion hub. The wealth generated from the annexed Pacific ports provided the collateral necessary to stabilize the dollar as a sovereign reserve instrument. By 1850, the financial center of gravity had migrated from Threadneedle Street toward the counting houses of Lower Manhattan. The war transformed Wall Street from a regional speculative hub into an institutional exchange capable of underwriting a continental empire. This architecture provided the fiscal blueprint for the industrial mobilization of the coming decades, ensuring that the primary credit of the Western Hemisphere was no longer dictated by foreign monarchs, but by the private interests governing the American capital markets. The 1848 territorial acquisition immediately catalyzed a systemic breakdown of the American bipartisan consensus, shifting the national discourse from external expansion to an irreconcilable internal debate over the legal status of the Mexican cession. The reintroduction of the Wilmot Proviso, which sought to prohibit slavery in any land acquired during the conflict, functioned as a legislative wedge that permanently fractured the Democratic and Whig parties along sectional rather than ideological lines. This political destabilization rendered the previous era's compromises obsolete, as Northern free soilers and Southern fire eaters engaged in a zero-sum competition for the governance of the New West. The spoils of the war, territories such as California and Utah, became the primary instruments of a domestic power struggle that threatened the structural integrity of the Union. By 1850, the legislative gridlock necessitated the Compromise of 1850, a complex series of trade-offs including the Fugitive Slave Act and the admission of California as a free state. While the Treaty of 1848 had settled the accounts of international financiers, it left the American state with a toxic legislative legacy that could not be liquidated through traditional banking mechanisms. The political center of gravity shifted toward radicalized regional blocs, as the Whig Party effectively disintegrated under the weight of the conscience versus cotton schism. This instability proved that while the war had secured a financial empire, it had simultaneously dismantled the constitutional equilibrium established in 1820. The acquisition of the West did not solidify the nation. Instead, it acted as a terminal propellant for the sectionalist friction that would culminate in total civil collapse. The total expenditure of the Mexican-American War, surpassing $100 million, represented a permanent restructuring of the American fiscal identity. While the military eventually returned to a peacetime footing, the federal government emerged from the conflict structurally tethered to the private credit markets that had enabled the invasion. The true victors of 1848 were not the field commanders who occupied territory, but the institutional underwriters who transformed a volatile military expedition into a standardized, long-term yield instrument. By 1850, the U.S. Treasury had successfully retired its short-term war scrip only by issuing massive tranches of consolidated debt, effectively granting the banking syndicates a permanent claim on the nation's future tax revenue. The final ledger reflects a definitive transfer of power. The military secured 1.3 million square miles of physical geography, yet the financiers secured the legal and financial mechanisms to control the capitalization of that space. The buyout served as the prototype for modern state finance, where sovereign nations provide the kinetic force to clear titles, while private houses provide the capital to manage the resulting assets. This relationship ensured that the American West was never a frontier in the sense of a lawless vacuum, but was born as a pre-collateralized corporate extension of the New York and London exchanges. The war's ultimate legacy was the creation of a perpetual debt cycle. The state's victory was a military fact, but the bankers' victory was a mathematical certainty. The expansion of the United States was the final act of a multi-turn financial maneuver that established the world's first truly capital-driven empire.